It starts with dust and the smell of old paper, an attic in a beaten-up colonial house outside of Hartford, the kind with uneven floorboards and a single string hanging from a naked bulb. I'm up there because my mother is gone now, and empty houses ask to be emptied. The storm outside keeps riffling the roof, shaking the rafters, a quiet place where the past waits to be touched. Under a moth-eaten quilt and a broken model airplane, there's a banker's box with my father's name on the side, written in a confident, slanted hand. Capt. Daniel Prescott. Until this moment, Captain Prescott has always been a myth I could only visit through a handful of photos. Him in a dark blue blazer, hat cocked, a line of silver on his temples, a smile that didn't often make it all the way to his eyes. He died when I was 4, 27 years ago, on a night everyone remembers for the fire on a hillside and the sirens that couldn't get there in time. The official story is printed and bound. Accident report, Redwood Airlines Flight 271. The kind of report that closes a wound by stitching it shut with language, probable cause in Courier font. I pry the box open and there it is, a spiral-bound notebook with a black cover. The cardboard scuffed, the coil bent in one place where someone must have slammed it in a bag. Inside, the first page is dated in thick blue ink, October 2nd, 1998. The handwriting is precise, pilot neat, each capital like a runway marking. My father kept a personal log, more than the official journey log, more than the technical entries in the aircraft's maintenance forms. These are thoughts, confessions even, about Flight 271 and the days before it. I turn another page and see words underlined twice. This isn't safe. You'd think I'd slam the cover shut. I don't. Instead, I sit down on the attic floor and start reading as the rain needles at the roof and the light flickers. The entries are blunt. He writes about a left pitot heat intermittent fault that comes and goes with a slap on the panel. He writes about an autopilot pitch channel that disengaged twice on climb out the week before and came back after recycling it like a misbehaving computer. He writes about a memo from management, keep the fleet on time through the upcoming holiday weekend, dispatch when legal. That phrase repeats, legal isn't always safe. What catches in my throat isn't the technical detail, it's the doubt. He circles sentences, he argues with himself, he talks directly to the page. It's like listening through a wall to a voice I barely remember. If I ground the jet, I ground my crew. If I fly it, I roll the dice with 200 souls. The official report, the one everyone points to when they want a clean story, says Flight 271 went down in weather, wind shear, pilot error in the last minute. The log in my hand says there was a storm long before the storm, a swirl of small failures, pressure, and a choice my father couldn't forgive himself for making. I want to be cynical, to assume grief is manipulating me, but every time I set the notebook down, I can't not pick it back up. The pages have weight. The ink is this deep, kick-you-in-the-stomach blue. Next to one paragraph, he's drawn a box, a habit I recognize from his flight manuals in a storage chest. Pay attention. In that box, Mel allows dispatch with one in-op warning, not two. Stick shaker test unreliable. Logged, no action. I hear the industry in that minimum equipment list, the legal way to leave the gate with something broken because redundancy is supposed to hold. But redundancy isn't certainty, not when the air is cold and wet over Pennsylvania and the ice starts to accumulate like tiny, invisible teeth. I carry the notebook downstairs like a relic. At the kitchen table, I empty the box. There are handwritten ACARS copies, Polaroids of a Boeing 737-300 on a sunlit tarmac, a photocopy of a union grievance, and a letter he never sent to a safety manager with a polite, furious opening. I am not in the business of gambling. The more I read, the more the official report starts to look thin, like a photograph that's been overexposed until only silhouettes remain. Maybe the board had reasons. Maybe the black boxes told a story that was easier to print. But the log is a living thing. It contradicts without grandstanding. It doubts without collapsing, and in the middle of it there's a line written in the midnight before the flight. If tonight goes wrong, someone will need to know. I look up and realize the house has gone quiet. The storm has paused. My hands are shaking. For the first time I have something my father meant me to have. But only if the worst happened. The worst did. So I begin. The NTSB report wears a uniform of objectivity. A slab grey cover, codes in the margins, a taxonomy of disaster that promises if we name things precisely enough, we will control them. I flip through its pages the way I've done 100 times before and read the lines that once felt like the only truth available to me. Redwood Airlines Flight 271, a Boeing 737-300, impacted terrain during an instrument approach to Denver International Airport on October 14, 1998. Contributing factors: convective weather with wind shear, crew's failure to maintain adequate airspeed, improper response to stick shaker activation. There's an entire paragraph about microbursts, a paragraph about training syllabi, a paragraph assigning weight to human factors, fatigue, workload, fixation. It is professional, careful, and terrifyingly complete. Except the diary in my kitchen says the checklist is missing items. My father's entries complicate every neat conclusion. The report says the stick shaker, that mechanical rattle meant to startle a pilot awake to an oncoming stall, activated appropriately, and the crew failed to respond. The diary: shaker test intermittent for weeks. On ground it passes twice, fails once. Noted to maintenance. No fault found. The report says the airspeed decayed because the crew let it decay. The diary writes of pitot heat, those tiny heaters that keep the feeds honest. Left intermittent, right tested strong. During climb last Tuesday, IAS disagree flag flickered. The report notes the autopilot disconnect as a reaction to the shaker. The diary logs 2 disconnections before the week of the crash, unconnected to any shaker, with the pitch channel hunting. This isn't a courtroom and I'm not a lawyer, but I'm a daughter with ink under her fingernails now, and the ink won't wash out. When the report quotes the cockpit voice recorder, my father's voice reduced to brackets and timestamps, it feels like a theft. Captain: speed, watch your speed. First officer: correcting. Sound of stick shaker, GPWS. Sync rate. There's nothing untrue there, just a flattening. My father's notebook gives those bracketed words a life. FO new to type, good scan, takes feedback well. Denver approach expects us to keep it tight. Vectors inside the marker. Told dispatch earlier, we need longer final in this weather. The board's diagram shows the airplane like an icon, sliding toward a runway threshold, a line that strays below glide slope, a jagged sawtooth of altitude and speed. It registers a pull, a push, an uncoordinated turn. It concludes the obvious: they lost control. But the diary talks about pressure that never makes it into charts. The company memo I found in the box about holiday operations. The ACARS exchange with dispatch where the phrase "legal to continue" recurs whenever "safe to continue" is asked. The difference is quiet enough to miss if you're not looking for it. He was looking. He underlined it so hard the cardboard indents left marks on the next page. I find a paragraph I can't stop reading because it feels like a confession addressed to me across 3 decades. I teach the kids that checklists make heroes out of mortals. Step, verify, cross-check. But what we don't teach is how to say no when everything around you says yes. We train for lightning, flameouts, bird strikes, but not for management smiling, "It's legal, Captain." I imagine him at a cheap kitchen table like the one I'm at now, coffee going cold, his hands around the pen the way they'd later hold a yoke, steady enough until they're not. When the report lists the probable cause, it ends with a period. My father's log ends each entry with white space, like he's leaving room for what he might learn tomorrow, or for a version of the story that will only exist if something goes wrong and someone goes looking. I am looking. And now the neat period looks less like an ending and more like a plug hammered into a bottle full of pressure. So I print copies of the log's most damning pages and lay them beside the report. The contradictions are not smoking guns. They are hairline cracks that run across the whole surface. Any one of them might be survivable. Together, under stress, they make shattering a question of when, not if. And the weather that night. It wasn't the storm that created the cracks. It was merely the weight that found them. October 5th, 1998. My father's handwriting leans forward as if it's trying to close the distance between the cockpit and the page. Left pitot, heat, intermittent. Test cycle, on-off with panel tap. Not enough to ground per mel? Dispatch said legal. Wrote it up again. F.O. Jensen agrees. It makes my skin crawl, Dan. Mechanic after arrival. We'll take a look. Paperwork, no fault found. The words look like they were pressed into the paper with more force than usual. The indents show up on the next page like a bruise. I pause to Google acronyms I only half understand. But I don't need a glossary to feel the instinct behind the entry. Airspeed is truth to a pilot. Pitot heat keeps that truth from freezing into a lie. He is telling the page, truth is flickering. He's telling himself, keep asking. He notes a training flight 2 days later with a junior crew. Shaker passes cockpit test. Stick pusher engages as expected. In flight, turbulence moderate. Autopilot pitch channel drops twice. Recycled, held. Log entry made. In the margin, a tiny drawing. 2 parallel lines like runways, a dot, then a broken arrow. It's shorthand that probably only made sense to him. To me, it looks like hesitation turned into a symbol. The entry shifts into something softer. Lily asked about stars. Told her there's no up in the sky, just away. She wants a telescope. I want to be home. Lily is me, a 4-year-old with a plastic cockpit in the living room made out of 2 dining chairs and my mother's colander as a captain's hat. It kills me, and it saves me that right between acronyms and checklists he writes about constellations. It says he never forgot who the flight was for. Then there's October 10th. Union meeting. Talked to Gary about pattern of intermittent faults cleared as no fault found. He says write narratives in addition to squawks. Make it undeniable. That word, undeniable, haunts the rest of the pages. My father starts stapling photocopies of his maintenance write-ups to his diary entries, as if he's assembling a case in real time. On October 11th, he writes, Dispatch ACARS, storms forecast den arrivals 10:14, slower approaches, recommend extra fuel. Response, plan normal, slower not guaranteed by ATC, no changes to block time. The log doesn't editorialize. It just puts one sentence next to another like brackets around a truth nobody wants to say out loud. The last page before October 14th is short and somehow the loudest. Moral math. If I no go, I'm the guy who costs 180 people their connections, puts 5 crews out of position, tanks a Christmas schedule. If I go, I'm trusting that the second system catches what the first misses, the training catches what luck does not. I hate this math. He underlines hate only once, but it might as well be a scream. I imagine him packing the notebook in his flight bag that afternoon, sliding it next to a laminated card of abnormals he's had since his first airline job. I imagine his fingers pausing on the cover, the way I pause on it now, feeling the friction of the cardboard and the coil. 9 days before the night everyone remembers, he wrote everything down, not to be dramatic, not to hide, not to accuse. He was building a trail because something inside him knew someone might have to follow it. We spend so much time telling ourselves that disasters are strings of bad luck. We spend so little time acknowledging the human beings who see the string forming and write it down anyway, even when the string ties around their own wrists. My father didn't solve anything on October 5th, but he left a map that, if anyone had looked, might have made October 14th just another night flight to Denver. The CVR transcript in the report is sterile by design. It flattens voices, clips breaths, compresses panic into square brackets, but I can hear the scene because my father's diary sprinkles human salt on the metal. I close my eyes and picture the 737-300 pushing back from JFK as twilight bleeds into the bay, the cabins settling after the ding-dong of the seatbelt chime. The cockpit is a small city of light, amber, green, a few stern reds that everyone hopes never turn on. My father, Captain Prescott, does the call-outs with a teacher's cadence. First Officer Jensen responds, steady, a touch fast, wanting to be perfect. We're legal to go. That's my father, quiet, deciding out loud. Not a bravado line, more like a verdict he doesn't believe in. He'd written hours earlier. Shaker test passed twice, glitched once, signed, pitot heat, both good on pre-flight. He signed too. He had to. You don't take an airplane with a broken pitot, but intermittent means it works until the moment it doesn't. The jet climbs out. The Hudson, a black ribbon flecked with coins of light. ATC turns them west. Over Pennsylvania, the ride starts to degrade, bumps turning into a steady tremor. The logbook's last same-day entry reads like a tone poem. Turbulence, light to moderate. Autopilot pitch channel drops once, recycle, holds. IAS disagree flag flicker. FO didn't call. I might have imagined it. Told myself I imagined it. I hate that line. It holds everything about being human and being wrong. They start the arrival into Denver. Weather is not apocalyptic, just the kind of sky that makes you earn your pay. Cells scatter the approach path. ATC choreographs vectors tighter than anyone would prefer. Dispatch texts show up over ACARs. Company requests expeditious arrival if able. Gate turn needed for 271D return to JFK. Translation, keep it moving. He doesn't write anger at that. He writes a box. Do not trade safety for schedule. If only boxes were as loud as thunder. Let's brief the ILS. His voice is calm, ointment on a burn. They call the minima, the missed approach, the special note about possible wind shear that night. All by the book. Then vectors inside the marker, closer than the sim. It can be done. It is done every day. But every day isn't this day. The stick shaker rattles for a flicker and stops. A hiccup. Or a warning that, like a bad dream, fades as soon as you wake. The official report says the shaker activated for real 30 seconds later. The transcript shows confusion crowding the cockpit like too many people in a small room. Captain, speed, FO. Correcting, Captain, pitch, pitch, pitch. GPWS, sync rate, Captain, add power, sound, stick shaker. The board claims inadequate response. The log written before this night claims an untrustworthy sentinel. If you hear the wolf cry too often, you start wondering if it's the wind. But if it's the wolf this time, you cannot afford to wonder for a second. He knew the trap. He marked it and walked into it anyway because the sky doesn't give you rehearsals. In his bag is that notebook. On the jump seat behind them, no one. In the cabin, 180 lives. A couple on their first trip without kids, a violin student clutching a hard case, a man with a small cooler holding a donor heart bound for a Denver surgical team. My father's log mentions that coolly, organ courier on board, time critical, advised. It's not hyperbole, it's a pistol on the table that makes every decision louder. Divert and the heart might die in a different way. Continue and the mountain waits to decide for you. The jet bucks. The autopilot drops with a chirp, hands on the yoke now. The speed tape stutters, or at least the human perception of it does, jangled by bumps and glare. One pitot probe lies to the system by a tiny margin. The other swears it's telling the truth. In the space between margins and truth, a crew lives or doesn't. He wrote earlier that week, teach the FO to trust his hands when screens are noisy. On the tape, Jensen says, I've got it, adding power. My father replies, don't chase it. Attitude, then power, then trim. This is the gospel. But when alarms stack, sink rate, pull up, gospel sounds like philosophy. Judgment gets sweaty, the nose wavers, the left wing complains, and then the transcript ends in impact. The diary has a last line written in the long afternoon before. If tonight goes wrong, someone will need to know. He didn't know it would be me. He just knew that the version of him reduced to brackets deserved a counterpoint, sung in the key of human doubt. In training, dilemmas are tidy. A red light blinks, a checklist appears, and the instructor waits for you to say the right words in the right order. What no simulator can reproduce is the push and pull between a flight crew and the invisible machinery of an airline. The screens, schedules, rotations, and memos that exist far from a cockpit but manage to live inside it anyway. My father's diary gives that machinery a voice. It never shouts. It smiles and says, "We're counting on you." He copied an ACARS exchange into his log, the pencil marks smudged where his hand must have rested. WX-Den, cells scattered, reports of shear on short final. Request longer vectors for stabilized approach. The reply is polite enough to frame. Traffic volume high, expedite if able, legal to continue. There it is again. The word that reads like a lawyer has entered the cockpit to sit in the jump seat, briefcase on knees, legal. It's not a lie, legality matters, but legal is a flaw, not a target. He knew it, he wrote it. And yet the flaw has a way of looking like a finish line when your phone is full of messages about Christmas coverage and you know the dispatcher by first name and the other crews by their kids' ages. In the next paragraph, he describes a call he made from the gate before pushback, an old habit, a way to turn text into tone. He asked the dispatcher whether the company would back a divert for holding or a go-around if the approach felt rushed in the weather. The answer, he writes, was appropriately supportive. Captain's discretion. That phrase is a golden ticket in safety culture and in practice, a coin that burns in your pocket. Because discretion is only as useful as the room you feel you have to use it. He scribbles a rectangle around the next sentence. Room feels small tonight. He wasn't imagining it. The day's rotations were wound tight. The airplane was scheduled to turn back to JFK as Flight 271D after a quick gate turn, then carry a crew into the early morning Transcon parade. There is a kind of domino logic to airline operations. If a single tile is late, a line of others trembles. He writes that he hates feeling like a tile. He also writes that he loves it when the line clicks smoothly down a day, a week, a season. He's honest enough to admit he cares about being the kind of captain dispatch remembers as reliable. The idea that wanting to be helpful could ever be a risk is something our industry names in conferences and still underestimates. He tried to carve space where there wasn't any. On descent, he asked Denver approach for an extended final, a 10-mile straight in to settle the airplane, arrange the energy, and let the bumps become information instead of noise. The controller's reply was the kind that arrives with an apology built in. Unable due to traffic, tight vectors for everyone tonight, maintain speed until 4 miles. None of that is egregious. None of it is unusual. It's the everyday texture of controlled sky. But the everyday, piled onto everything else you bring with you, can become a weight you don't recognize until your hands notice they are heavier. Some people think pilots live for challenge, that a short approach is an ego test passed with flair. The best pilots I've met like boring approaches in bad weather. Stability is victory, dullness is elegance. My father's notes admire First Officer Jensen's discipline. Good call-outs, wants to do it right, not impress. He watches for the signs that a young pilot is squeezing the airplane to meet an external promise. He warns himself not to do the same. He underlines the phrase, refuse choreography that asks for haste, and then draws a small arrow to the margin where he's written a single word. How? That is the dilemma no simulator teaches. You can fly the profile flawlessly and still feel the theater of it tug at your sleeves. The phrase, expedite if able, the gate agent radio hoping for an on-time, the organ courier spied in row 2 with a cooler that might be a metronome if you let it be. The rules are clear. If the approach isn't stable by a certain height, you go around. The human truths are less photogenic. Going around costs fuel and time, paints a bump on a schedule, and makes you, if only for a minute, the person who made everyone else late. The last line of this entry lands like a confession. I owe them a safe flight. I am terrified that tonight I will try to give them both. He wasn't worried because he doubted his skill. He was worried because skill is most dangerous when it's untroubled by doubt. Most of the industry trouble we call human factors comes from people who are good at what they do, trying to be good in 2 directions at once. There is a kind of courage that looks like saying no when yes would be faster. There is another kind that looks like saying yes when no would be safer. He knew which was which. Knowing and acting are cousins, not twins. By the time they were inside 20 miles, Denver had assigned them a localizer intercept that was perfectly flyable and poorly suited to conversation. The frequency was busy. The cockpit was busy. The weather didn't roar. It whispered a dozen little demands. A correction here, a power tweak there, a glance at a tape that quivered even when it was true, a memory of a test that had limped. In those demands, the elegant theory of discretion turns into practice, which is to say, into choices. If you ever wonder how disasters get written, it is in sentences like this one, copied from a captain's private page. We can do it. We probably shouldn't. We will. There's a reason the minimum equipment list exists. Airplanes are complicated organisms with redundancy built into their bones. The MEL is not a cheat sheet, it's a permission structure born of physics and probability, a manual that says, when this system is down, these other systems cushion the loss. You may dispatch. Without it, a single burnt-out bulb would ground fleets. With it, we keep a schedule and a promise. My father respected the MEL. What he feared, and wrote about in clear, level language, was the way it can be used to organize denial. He explains the trap with the tidiness of a teacher. If a warning system is intermittent but tests good on the ramp, the MEL may say you're legal if only one annunciator shows abnormal. If the stick shaker test burps once on the ground and then cleans up, and if maintenance inspects and returns the jet to service with a no-fault found note, you are not a cowboy for taking the clearance. You're following the book. But the book is brittle, where reality is messy. Intermittency laughs at checkboxes. He writes a line that should be printed on the inside cover of every MEL. The MEL assumes independence. Culture creates correlation. In plainer words, a single fault is manageable because other layers will stop the fall. But if the autopilot pitch channel is known to be occasionally testy, and if the pitot heat has a habit of sleeping on the job, and if your shaker sometimes performs like an actor who forgets a line, then shouts 2 at once, the idea that only one layer will be stressed at a time becomes a gamble, not a design. He describes 3 events that month where minor squawks were cleared with the phrase CND, cannot duplicate. He doesn't accuse any one person of laziness. He blames the physics of the line, airplanes moving, shifts ending, weather changing, 1,000 small incentives nudging the easy answer into the log. The log is where the trap tightens. A captain who uses it properly writes up faults, signs the forms, makes sure maintenance looks. A captain who uses it defensively also keeps his own diary, not because he distrusts people, but because he distrusts drift. He staples copies of his write-ups, underlines the times and tails, so that if a pattern emerges, it will be higher contrast than a stack of pages in 3 different binders across a month. That is what my father did. It is the part of his habit that feels least romantic and most heroic now. He documented patterns long before anyone asked him to prove one existed. He also wrote about the language we use. Inop, deferred, acceptable, dispatchable. None of these words are lies. They are ways to carry forward a known risk within a boundary the system believes is generous enough. But generous for whom? For the airplane, the day's plan, the people in 23A and 11F. He never pretends that grounding a jet is an easy, clean choice. Grounding it at JFK on a peak night might displace a crew bound for Phoenix, strand an aircraft that needs to be in Chicago by dawn, cascade into 100 reassignments. The MEL gives cover to carry an imperfection so that the system can absorb it. He writes that we forget too often that human attention is one of the layers designed to catch what a tolerant MEL carries. And attention is finite, especially in turbulence, especially when ATC is tight, especially when you're trying to be precise for a younger co-pilot who is watching you for cues. He tells a story from years before, flying freight in a storm with an anti-ice valve that stuck now and then. MEL legal, nothing fraudulent. The night had the same texture as Denver, weather, traffic, a small delay he wanted to make up. He writes about how his scan narrowed, not because he was lazy, but because the airplane asked for micro-decisions faster than his eye could re-widen. You end up trusting the machine you least trust, he writes, meaning the autopilot, because on nights like those, it feels like an extra set of hands, right up until it drops. If you have grown to rely on that extra set in subtle ways, its exit becomes not just a chore, but a shock. There is a quiet anger in him when he brings the trap back to Flight 271. He knows how the board will read it. The shaker sounded, the crew mismanaged the response, the airspeed decayed during a gust. The paperwork is satisfied with cause and effect. The diary insists on causes and effects, plural, braided. It is not an excuse. He writes the opposite. I am responsible even for the pressures I cannot see, but responsibility to him includes refusing to pretend that one neat paragraph can contain what a month of small compromises set in motion. He ends the chapter on the MEL with a suggestion I have never forgotten. What if every MEL deferral above a trivial class came with a mandatory debrief 2 weeks later, asking, how did this change your workload? What did you miss while you were watching it? We count the dollars saved. We rarely count the attention spent. Were he alive to say it into a microphone, I think safety conferences would quote him for years. Instead, I'm quoting a man at his own kitchen table, circling the gap between legal and safe, drawing the trap we built for him and asking without bitterness why we keep walking into it. On page 17 of the diary, ordinary handwriting suddenly changes size. The letters stretch as if the pen itself inhaled. The heading is matter of fact, medical courier on board, heart transport, ETA critical. In a documentary, this would be the moment the music darkens. In my father's life, it was a simple reality he accepted without drama. Sometimes your flight carries a clock more urgent than all the others. He describes the courier briefly, a middle-aged man with careful hands, seat 2C, clutching a hard plastic cooler with hospital stickers and a laminated card tagged to the handle. The gate agent brings a form to the cockpit before push, confirming that the captain has been notified and that ground handling understands the need for priority on arrival. My father notes that he walked back to 2C before they closed the door. He introduced himself, confirmed that Denver General had a surgical team waiting, asked the question he could do nothing about. How long do you have? The courier said what all couriers say, because they live in the same paradox pilots do. Never make promises, but always put numbers to hope. 4 hours is the happy number. 6 is the cliff. He writes with care about the ethics of time as a passenger. The other 180 souls, he notes, each have their own cliff, missed connections for funerals and weddings and custody exchanges, oxygen tanks waiting in Denver, a shift that starts at dawn. Yet the organ in 2C casts a particular shadow because it comes with the knowledge that somewhere, in a different hospital, a family has already stood at a bed, and said goodbye so that someone else might say hello for longer. Pilots are taught to compartmentalize. They are human beings, taught to perform temporary amnesia. Compartmentalization is merciful until it isn't. He admits he brought the Courier to mind on descent when he asked Denver for the longer final he wanted. He admits he held that image too long when approach could not grant it. He is harshest with himself here because he knows that noble pressure is pressure all the same. A good reason is still a distraction, he writes. This more than anything catches me by the throat. We spend so much of our lives hunting good reasons. To be told that they can threaten us like bad ones feels like a betrayal and a relief. The Courier's presence is a story with 1,000 mirrors. Somewhere in Denver, a scrub nurse would glance at the clock and project an arrival onto the center of her worry. A surgeon would step away to check a pager. A recipient would lie under lights with machines singing, their family tasting hope like rain after smoke. In New York, the donor's family would sit in a chapel or a hallway with that singular empty feeling that makes clocks cruel. Every one of those people had handed a piece of their control to an airplane full of strangers. My father carried that piece like a coin in his pocket, the kind of thing your hand finds without meaning to. He writes that he told Jensen about the Courier not to raise stakes, but to give shape to a radio call if they needed one. Priority handling if able. Medical case aboard. He explains that the phrase carries weight, but not magic. Controllers can make space, they cannot make new sky. He explains that any special handling rests on the same bedrock anyway. A stable, safe approach. Without that, priority is just a word. When pilots talk about time pressure, they rarely mean a ticking bomb. They mean the kind my father paints here, a set of parallel truths that line up just wrong enough that you cannot look at them all at once. The weather needs respect, the schedule needs mercy, the approach needs room. The fuel loves the idea of a straight-in. The organ hates the idea of a divert. In that field of vectors, character is not a speech, it is a scan. Where do your eyes go when a new request arrives? What do your hands do when a reason enters the room that would make a hero out of haste? I wish I could write that the Courier was a villain in disguise, an emblem of pressure that made sense to ignore. He is not a villain. He is a person who does holy work inside coolers. I wish I could write that my father never once thought of him after takeoff. He did. He is honest about that. He is also honest that the thought did not choose for him. If we cannot land safely, we will not. He deserves a living airplane to meet his living heart. I keep rereading that sentence because it tries, like everything else in the diary, to reconcile care with clarity. The kind of care that counts is the kind that knows how to let go when the math says so. On the ground later, paperwork would list wind shear and airspeed and training and end with a neat period. On these pages, an organ in a cooler sits quietly in the aisle, converting ethics into kilograms of felt weight. It did not force the outcome. It did something more ordinary and more potent. It traveled as a human reminder that every airplane carries more reasons than it can name. We trust numbers because they behave. The flight data recorder sketches altitude and speed and yoke position with the discipline of graph paper. The cockpit voice recorder takes the chaos of a human moment and gives it timestamps and brackets as if chronology can domesticate panic. Those boxes are gifts to truth. They are also blunt instruments in a world where the blades are small. My father's diary is a rebellion against bluntness. He doesn't argue with the data, he braids it. He notes that the CVR of that era loops, devouring its own tail every 30 minutes, preserving only the end of a story that started days earlier. He notes that the FDR doesn't record doubt. It records the inputs and outputs, not the reasons a pilot's eyes went left or right at an instant when either would have been defensible. He writes that maintenance computers are excellent at cataloging discrete write-ups and blind to patterns of intermittency unless a human draws lines between them with a pen that refuses to lift. He is unsentimental about human memory too. He knows how survivors' recollections can drift. He knows how grief edits. That's why he makes his case with ink made before the outcome, the purest timestamp available. He rewrites a concept I learned later in a classroom: normalization of deviance. In his words, it is simpler and scarier. If nothing bad happens, we start calling the previous bad thing normal. An autopilot that drops now and then but always comes back becomes a companion. A test that fails 1 of 3 tries becomes a quirk, then a character trait, then a joke. A culture that rewards on-time arrivals smiles a little broader at the crew that makes it work in weather. None of this is criminal. Most of it is human. All of it is dangerous if you are unlucky with wind. The board's graphs show a decaying airspeed in the last minute. A nudging of pitch, a late shove of power, the shakers rattle, the terrain warnings scolding, the sad final line of a descent that should have leveled out. The graphs do not show the week where test anomalies were dismissed, the morning a memo about holiday block times went out, the call my father made to a dispatcher to create grace and the grace that did not appear. They cannot. The problem isn't that the data is cold. It's that we ask it to warm rooms it was never built to heat. He proposes a different way to watch ourselves. What if, he asks in a late entry, diaries were standard? Not confessional diaries, operational diaries. 1 private page per captain per month, encouraged by the company, protected by law, reviewed by a safety office that is measured not by quiet, but by the number of near misses learned from. He imagines a system that treats first-person narrative as a kind of sensor that picks up signals between the ones and zeros. He is realistic about the costs. People will write for the record, he says. They will file to please the office. Some will polish, some will grandstand. But in those pages, patterns would appear that the MEL and the FDR cannot sketch. Where attention went, how pressure felt, when good reasons made bad choices more tempting. He revisits the pitot heat conversation, like a pilot tapping a gauge to see if the needle will settle. He explains how ice can fool a crew, not because they are ignorant, but because an ice sensor produces numbers that make sense until they don't. And by the time they don't, the horizon is full of other concerns. He wonders aloud whether the shaker's intermittent tests during the week functionally trained him and Jensen to expect a false rattle, and whether that expectation bled 1 too many seconds from the response when the real rattle came. The board cannot time that seep. The diary cannot either, but the diary can confess that seep exists, and confession is where a different safety begins. We love the phrase pilot error because it sounds like a place you can land. He proposes that we retire it in favor of system surprise, not to absolve anyone, least of all himself, but to remind us that surprise is a product with many authors. Training, design, policy, habit, weather, fatigue, luck. He doesn't deny the last minute. He refuses to pretend it was the only minute that mattered. If you put the printout of the FDR and the pages of his diary side by side on a table, one looks like a heartbeat and the other like a mind. The tragedy is that we keep asking the heartbeat to explain the mind and the mind to out-argue the heartbeat. The better way is to let them accuse each other gently. The data should force the diary to be honest about physics. The diary should force the data to be honest about context. Between the two, a different report could have been written, not one that absolves, but one that names what we keep pretending is too soft to print. He never says the board was wrong about the stick shaker, the airspeed, the glide. He says the story is bigger, and in the space of that bigger story, we might write different memos next time. We might measure different things. We might teach a different reflex when a sensor squeaks like a violin that hasn't been tuned. We might, after weather like that, praise a crew for asking for miles of final instead of speed. We might build time into plans like we build fuel into tanks, enough to go around without shame, enough to turn a legal flight into a safe one. There is a line at the end of the NTSB's probable cause that behaves like a door that has clicked shut. I spent years pressing my ear against it. With the diary in my hand, I knocked. The sound on the other side wasn't silence. It was the rustle of people who had been there all along, waiting for someone to ask a different question. I called the Union safety chair from that era, a man whose voice still carries runway gravel. He remembered my father as the one who wrote long. He meant it kindly. He told me that in the late 90s, Redwood's safety office was full of good intentions and thin staffing. Patterns that should have been obvious required someone with time to stitch them together. Time was a luxury, not a budget line. He met me at a coffee shop and read the pages I brought. He tapped the lines about CND write-ups and the autopilot pitch channel. We talked about that jet, he said. We didn't talk about it enough. I wrote to a retired NTSB investigator, expecting defensiveness. He surprised me. He explained with patient professionalism that an investigation is a photograph taken under pressure with the camera you can afford and the light you have. He agreed that diaries like my father's should be invited into the frame. He said that rules about evidence are designed to avoid blame games, not to muzzle context. He offered to read, to annotate, to tell me where an engineer would flinch and where a lawyer would pounce. He underlined the same sentence my eyes keep returning to. If tonight goes wrong, someone will need to know. He gave you a job, the investigator said. Not to exonerate him. To finish the story he started, I found an aircraft mechanic who had signed one of the no-fault found entries on that 737 and braced for anger. He did not defend a pen stroke, he defended a life. You look, you test, you clean a connector, you test again. It passes, he told me, and there are 7 more airplanes on the line. He cried when he said it. He didn't know my father had stapled his paperwork into a private book. He said he wished more captains would write like that, not to trap mechanics, but to save them from drift. I told him that was exactly how the pages read to me, not as exhibits, but as lighthouses. I visited a small memorial outside Denver where Flight 271's number is carved into stone and set my palm against the cold. A woman approached, hovering in that way strangers do when they are deciding whether to make their lives touch yours. She was Jensen's sister. We stood a long time without saying anything, and then, because silence is harder than words, we exchanged names. I told her about the diary. She flinched. Then she breathed. He was new, she said. Not green. New. We agreed that those 2 words are not synonyms. She told me he kept a notebook too, but it was all checklists and flashcards. We promised to send each other copies of things our brothers and fathers wrote, so that, in some makeshift way, the cockpit could be reassembled on a kitchen table. There were emails to the airline that yielded careful thanks and no appetite for reopening a closed file. There were messages from dispatchers, some still at Redwood, some retired, who said they would take the word legal and stop using it like a blessing when what a captain is asking for is space. There were student pilots who wrote to say they had never considered keeping a diary and now would, not as a record of heroics, but as a map of their thinking. If I could change the board's report, I would. If I cannot, then changing classrooms is not a consolation prize. It is a way to spend the currency the diary minted. A journalist friend asked if I wanted to go public. National outlets, prime-time interviews, the hot stage where nuance dries out under lights. The diary asked me to be louder. It did not ask me to be careless. I opted for a different theatre, safety conferences, union hangars, lecterns at airports where people listen with a kind of attention they reserve for voices that smell like jet fuel. I learned to tell this story without making saints or villains. I learned to say that pilot error is a sentence fragment. I learned that ending a report with a period does legal work, and the human work continues anyway. My daughter, named for the stars I once asked about, stood at the back of a lecture and watched me talk about her grandfather's handwriting. She asked what I wanted from all this. I surprised myself by having an answer that wasn't shy. I want a checklist item called Ask for Time, not a suggestion. A box you have to check and mean it. Ask for time from ATC. Ask for time from dispatch. Ask for time from yourself. Make room for stability the way you make room for fuel. Treat time like a safety system, not a luxury. She wrote the phrase on her palm. I pretended not to cry. I cannot move a period on a government PDF, but I can write a comma into every room that will have me. The diary gave me that. It made me believe that unfinished stories are not failures, they are invitations. Redwood Flight 271 will always end the same way on radar. It does not have to end the same way in people's heads. At the bottom of the box where the diary slept, there is a single page folded into thirds like a letter and never addressed. The date is October 12th, 1998. The salutation is formal enough to shiver. Mr. Wallace, Safety Manager. My father drafts an honesty that he never mailed. He lists the intermittent faults, the pressure to keep block times, the training gap between simulator neatness and real-world mess. He writes a sentence so plain, it feels like a verdict he was begging someone else to deliver. I can do this job well, but not if we pretend risk disappears when it passes a test. He is not angry in those lines. He is weary and precise. He suggests small, practical changes that do not require heroics. Attach narratives to MEL deferrals so patterns can surface. De-glamorize tight vectors in convective weather. Reward go-arounds in performance reviews the way we reward on-times. Train crews to hear the word legal as a starting point, not an end. He asks for a policy that every time a warning system tests intermittent in a week, a captain can request a fresh airplane with the kind of support that feels like a hand on the shoulder, not a finger on a clock. The page ends before the signature, as if he was called to the phone or the cockpit or dinner. The absence of ink after sincerely hurts worse than the wreckage photos ever did. It is an arrow pointing to a conversation that might have been. It is a mirror showing me my own choice to send what he didn't. The world we live in is too fond of heroes. It undervalues administrative courage, the kind that shows up as a memo that says, clearly, this will slow us down. It will also keep us alive. So here is what we do now, in his name and in the names carved in stone. We remind ourselves that checklists are not arguments. They are agreements. We write policies that defend crews who say no when yes would be faster. We teach in classrooms that stability is a moral value, not a preference. We ask dispatch to retire phrases that sound like absolution and adopt ones that sound like partnership. How can we get you space? What do you need to be unhurried? We print ask for time in bold on approach plates if we have to, not because it is a procedure, but because it is a posture. We build places for stories to live. We fund safety offices to read diaries, to invite them without fear of punishment, to protect them as learning, not ammunition. We change the scoreboard inside companies so that a captain who diverts and arrives late to keep passengers uneventfully bored is celebrated on Monday mornings alongside the crew that threaded needles. We teach young pilots to notice when good reasons, an organ in a cooler, a family waiting, a schedule held together by will, begin to press on their scan. We teach them the sentence my father nearly mailed, I can do this well, but not if we pretend. I return to the attic sometimes and read the lines where he switches from technical to human without changing pens. He tells himself to be brave enough to disappoint people. He tells himself that the person who will be most disappointed is him. He writes that the hardest thing about command is that command does not mean control. It means being accountable to limits. He writes, almost tenderly, that this job is a covenant. I will bring you home, and you will let me do it slowly if slowly is what it takes. On a clear night, I take my daughter to the hill behind our house and point at the sky. I tell her the truth he told me with a smile I can finally hear. There is no up, only away. I tell her that flying is saying yes to 1,000 aways and learning when to say no. We look for Jupiter, for the fat, kind light that reassures even when you don't know its name. We talk about how her grandfather left us a map of small warnings, and how the bravest part of love is not ignoring them. The film of that night in Denver cannot be reshot. But film is not the only way stories travel. They travel as policy and posture, as muscle memory and new rituals. If you find yourself some winter day in a cockpit with a schedule that hums, a vector that tightens, and a warning that has been a little unreliable lately, imagine a handwritten box that says "Pay attention," and imagine a voice that is not a scold, but a friend. Ask for time. Then ask. Let the world be late. Let people be bored. Let the airplane be a place where diaries like his are less needed because their futures have already been read. At the bottom of that unsent page, I finally take a pen and write the word, "He didn't." I sign for him, not because I am him, but because the sentence belongs in daylight. Then I fold the letter into my own to the world he left. Please slow down. We know how.